You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.
And so on October 6th, after the fire had taken place, Washington confides his thoughts a little bit more privately about the fire. And he says, by the way, I forgot to mention this, but Providence or some good honest fellow, in other words, God or some good honest fellow, did what Congress wouldn't let me do, which is they burn New York City. And then he kind of shakes his fist and says, however, enough of it still remains to answer the British agenda.
Hello, and welcome to episode 395 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. When we think about the American Revolution, our textbooks, books, and historic sites have trained most of us to think about the American triumphs and battles. Battles like Princeton and Trenton, Saratoga, and Yorktown. Or they've trained us to think about moments when the American revolutionaries overcame moments of despair, when all hope seemed lost, to triumph in the cause for independence, as they did during the hard winters of Valley Forge and Jockey Hollow. Benjamin Carp will help us view the American Revolution differently. Using details from his book, The Great New York Fire of 1776, A Lost Story of the American Revolution, Ben will help us consider the strategic military importance of New York City and its capture by the British. He'll also take us through the details of the Great New York Fire that destroyed approximately 20% of New York City in September 1776. So during our conversation, Ben reveals why the British and American armies wanted to hold New York City during the American War for Independence, how and why the British and American militaries used fire as an instrument of war, and details about the Great New York Fire of 1776 and what the evidence has to say about how that fire broke out. But first, this is a very special episode because this episode marks the 10th anniversary of Ben Franklin's World. I launched this podcast as a hobby back on October 7, 2014. I was working to research lots of books and articles, and I thought I needed a way to share my interest with early American history with more people. Plus, I really did want to connect people with well-researched history and the historians who do that research. So I know this is hard to believe, but I really thought back then that if I worked hard on this podcast for about 2 years, I might build an audience of around 1,000 people who shared my deep and at times very nerdy interest in early America. Now, you very quickly helped me see that there are way more than 1,000 people with an interest in early American history. Over the past 10 years, you have helped this show obtain nearly 13 million downloads. And you confirmed that there is a real great desire for well-researched information about the early American past. So thank you for joining me on this adventure and for making Ben Franklin's World a true success. I really appreciate you. Thank you for listening, and thank you for telling others about the show. Okay. Are you ready to investigate the Battle of New York and the Great New York Fire of 1776? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Our guest is a professor in the Daniel M. Lyons Chair of History at Brooklyn College. His research interests include urban politics, society, and culture in 18th century America. He's also the author of several books, including The Great New York Fire of 1776, A Lost Story of the American Revolution. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Benjamin Carp.
Thanks, Liz. It's great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you, Ben. Now, Ben, your book, The Great New York Fire of 1776, investigates a fire that destroyed a huge swath of early New York City during the American Revolution. And I wonder if, before we get into the story of the fire, if you would tell us what New York City looked like by 1774. Perhaps you could even take us on a tour of early New York City in, say, 1774 or 1775.
Sure. On the eve of the American Revolution, New York City was a town of about 25,000 people. There were wealthy men who lived in brick mansions along Broadway with their families, and there were poorer working class folks who lived in wooden houses that they constructed on Church of England lands west of Broadway. There were enslaved people. New York City was about 14% black. And there were artisans, retailers, newspaper publishers. It was a religiously diverse town, an economically stratified town, and a town with political factions. And it was a town of occasional fires, although New York City had never had the kind of major fire in the 18th century that Charleston had had, or Boston, or Montreal.
And what about the architecture of New York City? Something that surprised me during my study of Albany, New York, is that was also a city that experienced major and devastating fires in the late 18th century in the case of Albany. And those fires primarily took place because Albany just had so many buildings made out of wood. Was that the case in New York City as well?
Yeah, one of the really interesting ironies is that in the 1760s, the legislature tried to pass an ordinance saying, New York City looks very vulnerable to fire to us. All this wood construction is not great for the city's future. Let's mandate that future construction be in brick and stone, use slate tile for the roofs, because this could be dangerous otherwise. And then the city's carpenters were up in arms, and you have massive petitions with tons of signatories saying, no, you'll throw all the carpenters out of work. We need to be able to continue to build in wood. It's less expensive, et cetera, et cetera. And so they keep postponing this legislation session after session. And then finally in 1775, they're like, well, maybe the next session we'll do it. And then the war comes. And so this law never passes. And so as a result, because of building codes, New York City is still largely made of wood and is therefore vulnerable to a major fire.
While we're on the topic of city politics, you mentioned that New York City had a lot of political factions on the eve of the American Revolution. Would you tell us about those factions and where the loyalties of New Yorkers may have lain in 1774, 1775?
The classic political factions are the Delanceites versus the Livingstonites. The Delanceys tended to be more invested in British trade, and therefore a lot of them tended to become loyalists when the war begins. The Livingstonites tended to be more invested in upstate land holdings, and many of them end up aligning with the Patriot faction, but not all of them. And in the midst of these long-time rivalries, there was political factionalism in New York going all the way back to the late 17th century. But amidst all of these rivalries in the 1760s, a new faction emerged, which are the Liberty Boys, or the Sons of Liberty. Alexander McDougall, John Lamb, Isaac Sears, talking with people in taverns, as my first book says, and trying to encourage people to say, hey, let's think about the laws that Parliament has passed. We really ought to be up in arms about this. We're not happy with the direction that the British Empire is taking. They'll align with one faction or another during the 1760s and early 1770s. And this is a new faction in New York's politics.
I suspect we don't have an answer for this, but on the off chance that we do we know how many New Yorkers followed this more revolutionary-leaning faction, the Sons of Liberty, the Liberty Boys, versus those New Yorkers who supported the Delanceites and their more loyalist ideologies?
It's hard to come up with numbers because, of course, we don't have Gallup polls for the 18th century. We can look at some of the elections. There are some key elections in the 1760s to kind of see which way New Yorkers were swinging. And imperial politics were often on people's minds, but it wasn't always the dominant thing. And the Delanceites and the Livingstonites still have the power of patronage that they can deploy in elections. Ballots are not secret. And so if your employer is standing there saying, which way are you going to vote? Which ballot are you holding? Even though the franchise was pretty wide in New York, a lot of working class people kind of voted the way their bosses told them to. So it can be difficult to say how patriotic New York was or how involved with the Sons of Liberty New York was. And this has actually been a dispute among historians going back to the 19th century. There are some historians who claim New York was all a loyalist town, which was the New Englanders' line on New York. That may not have been accurate. So Philip Branlett, for instance, a professor at Hunter College, writes this book saying, actually New York City was just as inclined towards the Patriots as any of the other large cities. But what you see in the seaport cities of North America is that you have these very active radical factions who use the newspapers, who use street politics, who use petitioning and boycotts and all these other tactics. But you also have strong loyalist factions, of course, who are employed by the government or members of the Church of England or are involved in overseas trade and have all these other reasons to maintain their connections to the British Empire.
Yeah, I think my read on the political situation in early New York City, having studied the revolutionary politics of New England and what is now upstate New York and the Hudson Valley area around Albany, is that New Yorkers in New York City tended to be cautious. I think cautious is a good word because, as you said, I don't think we can really quantify Revolutionary era loyalties with any accuracy in any area of what was the 13 British North American colonies. But my sense is that New Yorkers weren't necessarily not revolutionaries as much as they were people who were cautious about picking sides than perhaps other areas of the 13 British American colonies.
Yeah, I mean, that's why Joseph Tiedemann calls them reluctant revolutionaries. I think it's certainly true of New York's early delegations to the Continental Congress, right? They're given instructions to say, don't jump with both feet into independence, right? We don't know whether that will be good for business. And so compared to New Englanders, the New Yorkers look like they're dragging their feet. And that's one of the reasons why New York ends up gaining this reputation, particularly among New Englanders, as a Tory town. Of course, the other issue is that there were British warships in the harbor in 1775 all the way into 1776. And so that is a very good reason for at least the people of New York City to remain very cautious.
Now, when we think of the American Revolutionary War and what war meant for everyday British Americans, many of us would recognize that British Americans could expect death. War brings death, right? They could also expect political change, especially if they happened to live in a city or town that was occupied by either one of the armies. But one ramification of war that maybe we don't think of, and which Ben highlights in his book, The Great New York Fire of 1776, is that British Americans during the Revolutionary War often experienced the ever-present danger of fire. And one way we can start to understand this ever-present danger of fire is in 1775, British General Thomas Gage gave permission to Vice Admiral Samuel Graves to lay waste to such seaport towns. And subsequently, the British Navy did burn seaport towns like Falmouth, Maine, and Norfolk, Virginia, which at the time, Norfolk was the sixth largest city in British North America. Ben, why was fire a constant aspect of what would become the War for Independence? And why did the British seek to burn and lay waste to British American seaports and coastal towns? What was the strategy of that?
I actually think that the British have somewhat mixed feelings about this. There were factions within the British Army and Navy, and Stephen Conway points this out, who were fire and sword men, who were like, the only way that we're going to be able to make these rebels return to their obedience to the king and to Parliament will be to strike fear into them by burning towns. It's the only way to teach these American rebels a lesson. Certainly they had used fire in putting down rebellions in Scotland and Ireland, and they had no compunction about burning the homes of indigenous people throughout the world. So for that reason, burning towns among some British leaders was thought to be fair game because the Americans were in rebellion. But there were other people in Britain who said, well, hold on, these people are our cousins, effectively. We have relatives on both sides. We feel sympathetic toward them in some degree. They practice religion like us, look like us, talk like us. Maybe we shouldn't be so quick to burn their towns. That seems like a rather impolitic way to return colonial Americans to their allegiance. So maybe we ought to be cautious about burning towns. So there were other people in the British Armed Forces who were considered conciliationists, right? Who said, well, burning towns is maybe not the best idea. It's not great for public opinion, either in Britain or in the American colonies. One thing I should hasten to add, by the way, is that the burning of Norfolk had begun with a bombardment by the British Navy, but actually it was North Carolina and Virginia militiamen affiliated with the rebellion who burned about 85% of Norfolk. So the Americans turned around and blamed the burning of Norfolk on the British, but in fact it was the Americans who burned Norfolk themselves.
So what was the military strategy behind using fire to destroy these towns? Because you just mentioned that it's not just the British who used fire, but the revolutionaries as well. So what advantages are both sides getting out of using fire to drive people from their homes and businesses?
Well, for the British, sometimes it's done to follow through on a threat, right? You'd better continue to supply our ships or we will lay waste to your town. Or we are finding you obnoxious for some reason, and if you don't knock it off, we will burn your town. Obviously, if you burn a town, you might burn a naval yard, you might prevent it from becoming a military advantage to the other side in some way. So there are plenty of reasons for both sides to do it. Sometimes burning towns is situational. So for instance, during the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British are in Charlestown. There are rebels firing at them from homes in Charlestown. So they say, okay, burn Charlestown to the ground, which was a fairly large town just in sight of Boston. This is in June of 1775. It's really the first major burning of the American Revolution. So there were reasons why the British might burn a town. And for the Americans, the idea becomes, if the British are interested in these seaport towns, to use them as winter headquarters, as naval bases, as ways to bring loyalists back under their umbrella, then for the Americans, it was really tempting for them to consider a scorched earth strategy. Let's burn these towns in order to deprive the British of using them for their advantage.
Now, the American War for Independence officially broke out with the battles of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts on April 19, 1775. And as Ben just mentioned, there was also fighting in the Boston area during the Battle of Bunker Hill, on June 17, 1775. But during that winter, the winter of 75-76, the British encamped in Boston. And you may have heard the story of how during that winter, Henry Knox, a Boston-born bookseller turned Continental Army artillery officer, went to northern New York to Fort Ticonderoga, where he took cannons for the revolutionary cause. To get those cannons to Boston, he transported them across the frozen Hudson River and over the Berkshire Mountains. And then, when in Boston, he placed them on Dorchester Heights. Dorchester Heights is a hill that at the time allowed George Washington to train his newly acquired cannon right into Boston and on the British Army stationed there. You may have also heard the famous tale of how George Washington basically told General William Howe that if he and his army left Boston unscathed by fire, he would not use his new cannon to destroy the British position in Boston. So that's why Boston has so many 18th century historic buildings today, because the British retreated without ever burning the city. After the British Army left Boston, they sailed to Nova Scotia. That's where they resupplied and strategized, while George Washington took his new Continental Army south to New York City to try and fortify a position there. Ben, with that background in place, we're now back into our story. Why did it seem like the British wanted to control New York City? What did New York have to offer the British?
Well, the British are not entirely idle when they are there in Halifax, Nova Scotia. They are planning a massive expeditionary force of about 40,000 soldiers and sailors that they are going to bring to New York Harbor in order to take New York. New York City will give them access to Long Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, and the Hudson River Valley. If they're ever going to link up with British forces in Quebec, they are going to do so through the Hudson-Champlain corridor. So in the minds of British planners, New York City looks like the key. It will give them a beachhead for putting down this rebellion, which they hoped might remain confined to New England. It will cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. It looks like a perfect place to stage an offensive operation for pacifying the American rebellion. So New York becomes militarily the most important place in the 13 colonies, beginning in the spring of 1776.
So I see the tactical advantage that New York City would offer the British, but why didn't the British just try to cut the head off the American rebellion by going to Philadelphia and disbanding the Second Continental Congress?
That's a good question. I guess it must have something to do with the fact that there had already been a constant British naval presence in New York. There had also been a consistent British headquarters presence in New York from the 7 Years' War and before that. So they were already accustomed to having British garrisons there. It had been the headquarters of the British Army during the 7 Years' War. And also, Philadelphia gives you access to the Delaware River, which does take you in between Pennsylvania and New Jersey. But the Hudson seemed like it was going to become more important, I guess. So I haven't really looked into whether Britain was seriously considering taking Philadelphia instead. I think the British must have known on some level that just taking out a capital would not necessarily gain them the rest of the colony. Actually, maybe they don't realize that because they come to grief in Charleston, South Carolina for that reason. There have been a ton of historians lately who have said, yeah, actually the British fixation on New York was a mistake. But Washington is weirdly fixated on New York too, even after he loses New York. Throughout the war, he's like, when can we retake New York? And he actually has to be talked down from that to launch the Yorktown expedition in 1781. So both sides, I think, really looked at New York and they looked at maps and they said, strategically, this place is key. And so there's this sort of weird obsession with New York on both sides. I mean, a lot of British naval commanders were like, why are we touting this idea that New York has a good harbor? I mean, New York Harbor is really annoying. We'd be better off if we were in Newport, Rhode Island or something like that if we really want to have a station on the American seacoast. So even though the plan is let's make New York the center of our focus in 1776, I think a lot of historians have said, yeah, all this focus on New York was probably, in retrospect, a little bit of a mistake.
And what about political strategy? How much do you think the idea that New York City was seen as an emerging loyalist stronghold, how much do you think that idea played into the British decision to make New York, with its, annoying harbor, their target in 1776?
Well, this is another thing that historians have constantly said about British tacticians is that they are constantly overestimating the number of loyalists that were in a lot of these regions, the entirety of the South, but also New York City, right? The British were looking at New York and they're like, well, New Englanders are probably lost to us, but these New Yorkers, they seem to be more sympathetic. We have a lot of really strong allies there. We know there's a loyalist population. And then what they do is they overestimate the size of that loyalist population. So they figure, well, as long as militarily we can kick Washington and his army out of New York and put up the Union Jack there, then loyalists will flock to our colors. We'll be able to reestablish markets. And at that point, then we'll be able to roll up not just New York City itself, but Long Island, New Jersey, and the Hudson River Valley and create a loyalist stronghold there. So there are military reasons for taking New York, and there are these political reasons, as you say.
So after the British evacuated Boston in March 1776, the American Continental Army made its way to New York City, and the British troops eventually followed. Everyone was preparing for a fight, and that fight finally erupted on August 22nd, 1776. Ben, would you tell us about the battle for New York City?
Yeah, I should say that the British are showing up in large numbers in the harbor as early as June when they take Staten Island. Then at that point, they bide their time before making their move on Long Island, which happens on August 22nd. So they take Brooklyn, and at that point, once they have cannons placed on Brooklyn Heights, although Washington is lucky enough to make his escape, he rapidly realizes that holding Lower Manhattan will no longer be tenable for him. So at that point, he moves his headquarters to what's now the Morris Jumel Mansion in Upper Manhattan, and he's able to hold on to Upper Manhattan for a little while longer. But in the meantime, the British will take Lower Manhattan on September 15th at the Battle of Kip's Bay.
Now, how did this battle play out? Was the British assault on New York mostly a land assault? Or because you said there's a lot of ships in the harbor, was it mostly a naval assault?
Well, they used troops to establish their beachhead, but of course, the naval support is incredibly important. The Americans have nothing to match that. And so the British have tons of large warships. They send some of them up the Hudson. They have a lot in the East River, but a lot of them are just kind of off of Governor's Island, Staten Island, and then after the British take Brooklyn, they have some off of the western coast of Brooklyn or Gravesend, etc.
By September 15, 1776, George Washington and his men decided that they couldn't hold on to New York City, and they retreated. Ben, would you take us through the circumstances and thoughts that led George Washington to the decision to give up New York City and perhaps even restart his campaign?
Well, I don't know that Washington was looking to start over his campaign, but he does realize that New York is not tenable. He hates to give up fixed positions like New York because he knows it looks bad in the rest of the country to be constantly retreating. However, he's in a terrible position, especially once the British are in place in Brooklyn. He's not quite outnumbered, but the problem is that he's trying to defend an archipelago. And so he has to just keep smaller amounts of men throughout the New York area. That leaves him vulnerable because the British have all this maneuverability with the Navy and their transport ships. And so they can land a massive force and outnumber a smaller portion of Washington's army wherever the British choose. And so Washington is like, okay, I have three choices here. I can stand and defend, but all that'll mean is that my army will be either wiped out or captured. Or I can leave, and at that point, my choices fork into two. I can burn New York City behind me to deprive the British of its advantages, or I can leave it intact and live to fight another day.
So it sounds like the decision that Washington made that his troops would retreat without burning New York City was really what he thought would be best for the revolutionaries' future war effort, and perhaps even keep the goodwill of New Yorkers.
I mean, Washington is always concerned about his own reputation, and he is very canny about American public opinion. He definitely was not going to burn New York City unless the Continental Congress was willing to take responsibility and take the responsibility off of his shoulders. So he actually writes to the Continental Congress and says, hey, should I leave New York City intact when I leave? And so Congress, at least in the surviving correspondence, says, no, don't burn New York City. We feel confident that you'll be able to retake it someday. Just, retreat, use your best judgment on when to retreat and leave New York City standing.
So Congress tells Washington not to burn New York City. What was the actual retreat of the Continental Army like?
The Battle of Kip's Bay is sort of an embarrassment. The Americans had assumed that the Connecticut militia would hold out a little longer. The ordinary Connecticut rank and file become disgusted with their commanders for sort of panicking and not displaying good leadership. So as these British and Hessian soldiers begin landing on Manhattan Island, what happens is this panicked retreat. About a third of the army on Manhattan was still in the city itself at the lower end of Manhattan. So they just run for their lives up the roads leading to Upper Manhattan. And it's a close thing. I mean, the British army was moving westward across Manhattan and could have, if they moved a little faster, cut off a third of Washington's army at that point. But instead, much of Washington's army is able to escape to Upper Manhattan, but still they are running so fast and in such chaos and leaving all their equipment behind and in such a panic that the New England portion of the army acquires kind of a bad reputation. And there's a lot of bad blood as a result of the retreat on September 15th, 1776.
So the Continental Army has evacuated and retreated from Lower Manhattan by September 15, 1776. And as we just discussed, Washington and the Continental Congress have agreed that even if Washington has time to burn New York City as he retreats out, he's not actually going to burn it down. But the Great New York Fire happened anyway on September 21, 1776. Ben, what happened? What was up with the Great New York Fire? Actually, don't answer that question quite yet. Let's take a moment to thank our episode sponsor. Did you know that Ben Franklin's World has a listener community? The Ben Franklin's World Facebook group is a place where you can connect with fellow listeners, stay up to date with some of the latest history news, and it's a place where you can post episode requests and interview questions for our guests. There are even some listeners in that group who have formed a book club, and they're always looking for new members. So if you'd like to consider the books that we've discussed on this show more deeply, or read other books about early American history, you should join the Ben Franklin's World Facebook group. The group is free to join. Just visit benfranklinsworld.com/Facebook. That's benfranklinsworld.com/Facebook. I look forward to seeing and speaking with you there. Ben, would you take us through the Great New York City Fire that started on September 21, 1776?
This is really tricky, right? Because here's where we come up against the historian's problem of conflicting sources written by people who were writing in the aftermath of this fire that had lasted for 8 to 10 hours and had led to a lot of running around and panic. There are some accounts that say, oh, the fire started in some wooden shack at Whitehall Slip on the tip of Manhattan. And then the wind was high and it picks up these wooden shingles and the flames spread further and further north. And at the end of it, 20% of the city has burned down. So that is the narrative of the fire that says that it was completely accidental. On the other hand, there are a lot of people on the ground who say, I saw the fire break out in several places at once. We caught people holding matches and other incendiary materials running away from the fire. We caught people in the act of setting buildings on fire. We threw some of them into the flames. And these observers concluded, without a doubt, that American saboteurs had deliberately set New York City on fire.
So we have a bit of a historical mystery here. Lots of different conflicting accounts. So Ben, how did you as a historian set about trying to piece together what happened the night of the Great New York City Fire in 1776? And what caused that fire? What kinds of historical evidence and sources did you use to get to these firsthand accounts, even if they were conflicting?
Yeah, one of the interesting things about this fire is that there have been compilations of primary source accounts about the fire going back to the 19th century. There have been a few occasions when an editor has said, let me get these different firsthand accounts of the fire. So there was already a place to start. One of the most unique sources that I used are at the New York Historical Society, which is a collection of about 40 depositions that were taken in 1783 about people who had been mostly witnesses to the fire and talked about and remembered what they had seen. But there are several other sources as well. There's correspondence from British officers who were witness to the fire and then right back home to Britain. There were official reports from British commanders. There were newspaper articles a little bit later on. I actually used ship's logs from the Royal Navy that I found at the National Maritime Museum or at the British National Archives at Kew. There are diaries from ministers and other people who were still in New York at the time. So I tried to put together all of these firsthand accounts from the American side, from the British side, from Hessian officers, from civilians, from people who heard rumors behind American lines in New Jersey and in the Hudson Valley. I tried to put together all those accounts and say, what happened here? Who was the closest to the fire? Who's writing most immediately after the fire? For stories that were told much later, is there any corroboration that I can find? And I tried to use all of these accounts in order to reconstruct just what took place here. Was it an accident or was it on purpose? What started the fire and what explained why the fire took the course that it did?
I'd really like to know what you think, but before we dive into that, you mentioned that newspapers played a role in serving as a collection of evidence that tried to explain what happened on September 21, 1776. And I wonder if you would tell us what you found in the newspapers.
Newspapers turned out to be a fascinating source for me. And my guess, although I haven't confirmed this, is that academic historians will be the most interested in Chapter 11 of my book, where I talk about how the story of the burning of New York City took shape. Now, that story took shape in part from correspondence, people writing to one another, but then it becomes solidified once the story of the fire makes its way into print. Now, there is a loyalist-leaning newspaper that's established in New York City sometime after the British occupation. So the New York Gazette and Weekly Mercury puts out an account that was written probably by two loyalists, Ambrose Searle, who was serving with the British Navy, and Charles Inglis, who was a minister in the Church of England. They put together an account that blames the rebels for having set New York City on fire on purpose. And it ends with a message like, look, New Yorkers, you put your faith in this rebellion and your property just got burned. So clearly you ought to become a loyalist going forward. Because look at what the Americans did. They wantonly burned one of their own cities, and look at how terrible and irresponsible they were. Now, the Americans can't leave that alone. They say, we don't know how this happened. This appears to have been an accident. Maybe the British torched it themselves. And then they start to create this kind of distraction, like, pay no attention to the fire. Look at what the British troops did when they landed in Boston. They were cutting people's throats. They were plundering. They were treating civilians in this terrible manner. The British are the ones who are out there committing atrocity. So that's what the rebel newspapers begin to say. And so the Americans read these kind of conflicting accounts, and eventually there are other important events of the war, and so people forget about it. But the American newspapers are still kind of bothered by this in November of 1776. There'll be a fight a couple of years later in the newspapers. The British renew accusations that the Americans had burned New York City. So it becomes a little bit of a newspaper war over how the fire had started.
Just like the Boston Massacre, the Great New York City Fire of 1776 is an event that we're never going to know exactly what happened during this event of the American Revolution. But Ben, you have read all of the different testimonies and newspaper articles that you could find. So what do you see as the general consensus among New Yorkers in late 1776 about who or what caused their city to burn? What do New Yorkers think about the origins of this fire?
You know, on the basis of some casual things that people say during the war years after 1776, it seems to have basically been an article of faith among the people living in the British garrison, right? So living in British-occupied New York City, that the Americans had set the fire on purpose. They basically take that for granted. Outside New York, among rebellious Americans, they don't necessarily believe that, in part because of the public opinion campaign that the Continental Congress and Washington and his men and rebel newspaper printers had launched.
So that's what contemporary New Yorkers thought, was that the Americans set the fire on the way out. Revolutionaries, people who leaned revolutionary, didn't believe that. They may have thought that the British started it or it started by accident. But what about historians? Historians over the years have also speculated about how the Great Fire of 1776 started, and they've questioned whether the revolutionaries or the British set this fire, just as contemporaries questioned and debated that topic. So Ben, would you tell us about the history of historians' thoughts about what and who caused the Great Fire in New York in 1776? And, we'd also love to know what you personally think from all the research that you've done. What do you think about who started this fire?
Yeah, one of the really fascinating things that I did is I went back and read every 19th century history I could, both histories of New York City, biographies of George Washington, and then kind of general histories of the war. And I said, what kind of conclusion did most historians living in America arrive at? And for the most part, they basically conclude, we don't know what happened, but it certainly looks like an accident. At worst, it was some miscreants who had no political affiliation whatsoever who set this fire. And I was like, why do they think that? And the two reasons why they think that are they read the correspondence between Congress and Washington, which was published in the 1780s, 1790s. So the correspondence between Washington and Congress becomes public. And that seems to suggest that Washington asked Congress for permission to burn New York City. Congress said no, and Washington said, okay, I won't burn New York City. And that's all they need to know. And they're so busy admiring Washington for his deference to civilian authority, et cetera, that they basically just take this line. The other person who I blame for the distortion of the story of the burning of New York is David Grimm. Now, David Grimm had been a loyalist. He was a German-American tavern keeper who then becomes a city father. He becomes a one-percenter. He founds a lot of New York's financial institutions. He was basically a reconciled loyalist. And at the end of his life, he had lived so long and drawn some really beautiful maps of New York City that people went to him and said, hey, could you tell us about some of the major events that happened in Old New York? Can you tell us about the 1741 Negro conspiracy? Can you tell us about the burning of New York City in 1776? And what he does is he tells a story that in some ways is vague, but in other ways is weirdly precise. He says 493 buildings burned during the fire. That figure is definitely a lowball estimate. And he basically implies that the fire had a single point of origin. And he essentially leaves it open-ended, but leads a lot of New York City historians of New York, to say, oh, well, David Grimm was there, and he was this kindly old antiquarian. He had been a loyalist. He had lived there during the occupation. Here he's making a kind of statement against interest and saying, oh, it wasn't necessarily the Americans who had done it. And so they take that story and they say, here we are. New York City is now this great city. They are loyal to the United States, and their commander-in-chief, Washington, the first president, certainly did not order the burning of New York City. So it becomes an article of faith among New York City historians, American historians, and biographers of Washington that Washington and his men had nothing to do with the burning of New York City. Now, in the 20th century, historians know to kind of puncture myths and look a little bit more closely at this, but they still kind of say, well, the evidence is all over the place, and they kind of throw up their hands. And I think they are far too eager to ignore all of these loyalist and British accounts that insist that the Americans had burned New York City. I don't know why. Now, one interesting thing that happens, though, in the post-World War II era is that historians now have access to a private letter that Washington had written to his cousin, Lund Washington, who had been the caretaker of Mount Vernon during the war. And so on October 6th, after the fire had taken place, Washington confides his thoughts a little bit more privately about the fire. One thing he says is that, Congress ordered me to burn New York City, but I think that was a terrible mistake. This is going to go down in history as one of their biggest errors. And then he kind of leaves it and he talks about something else for a paragraph. And then he says, by the way, I forgot to mention this, but Providence or some good honest fellow, in other words, God or some good honest fellow, did what Congress wouldn't let me do, which is they burned New York City. And then he kind of shakes his fist and says, however, enough of it still remains to answer the British agenda. His only regret is that more of New York City hadn't burned. And so a lot of historians read that and they're like, well, wink, wink. It does kind of seem like Washington knows more than he let on here. There have been some historians who are willing to say, yeah, Washington may well have known more about this than he suggests. John Ferling kind of says, well, maybe it's like King Henry II, right? He kind of goes to his officers and says, well, no one rid me of this meddlesome city. And without directly ordering it, one of his junior officers or staff officers was like, I got you, chief, and sent some spies into New York City, or left some spies in New York City to burn it down. So again, we're not going to have smoking gun evidence. We don't have an order from Washington saying, yeah, whatever Congress said, ignore that, or a secret order from Congress telling Washington that he could do this. We don't have any document that has Washington dead to rights that suggests to historians that he definitely burned New York City. But I think that historians can use a kind of preponderance of evidence standard to say, well, whether Washington ordered it or not, it was definitely Americans affiliated with the rebel cause who burned New York City. And the way that I know that is that I tried to piece together, okay, the British actually catch some people burning New York. Who were they? What was their background? What was their political affiliation? What was their level of radicalism? And what might have led them to burn New York City, either under Washington's orders or in defiance of what Washington and Congress might have been willing to order?
So what did you do as a historian to try and answer some of these many questions that you're asking as best as you could? And I'm also wondering, did the Americans or British ever launch a formal investigation about the fire and its causes that you were able to access and learn more from the captured parties about who they were and who they were affiliated with? Because you mentioned earlier that they were able to catch, in some of these accounts, they reported being able to catch some of the people with matches in their hands starting fires.
Yeah, you've asked two questions. One is, what did I do in order to reconstruct this story? I first got interested in this story back in 1997. One thing I did is over the past more than 25 years is every time I would be in an archive or a major collection, I was like, oh, they were in the New York area in late 1776. Let me see if they have anything to say about the fire. And so I would just go looking for needles in haystacks all day long. I think there's still more work like that to be done in Connecticut archives. I was going to spend a week at Beinecke and at the Yale manuscript collections, but then the pandemic happened. And so my point is there may well be more stuff to find. And I'm hoping that this book will put up a bat signal to other researchers saying, hey, if you can verify some of the claims that I'm making here, I'd really appreciate that. But with the evidence that I did compile, there's plenty to suggest that the Americans had done this on purpose. If you put the little pieces together, you can really see it. But a major source of evidence for me, going all the way back to 1997, was a formal investigation that the British commander-in-chief, Guy Carleton, launched. He appointed 3 of his officers, including his chief spy, to kind of say, hey, could you interview a bunch of people and determine what the cause of the New York City fire was? One thing I found many years later is that there also seems to have been another investigation that the commandant, General James Robertson, launched in 1776, in the immediate aftermath of the fire. They round up a bunch of people, they have them in jail, they interrogate a bunch of them, and then for whatever reason, that investigation goes nowhere. And I speculate into the book as to why that was. But there was some kind of inquiry in 1776, and then the British kind of just let it go. We don't have any records from this because it seems to be the case that these records were in William Howe's personal papers, and the Howe's personal papers burned in a fire at Westport, Ireland in 1826. So we don't know much about that 1776 investigation. We can kind of reconstruct it a little bit, but not very well. We also don't know who the British put in prison in the immediate aftermath of the fire, although they definitely put some people in prison. We don't have a complete list of those people, of who they imprisoned and when, because that list was lost at sea in 1780. So that's two problems. But one investigation that does survive, and weirdly, it doesn't survive in the British National Archives, but was in private hands, and still is in private hands at the New York Historical Society, were this list of 40 depositions. So these 3 British officers sit down with 40 witnesses and they say, what do you know about this fire? Who started it? What did you see? What happened to the firefighting equipment? They ask all of these questions, and we have these 40-something witness testimonies that speak to what had happened on the night of the fire. This is in October of 1783. The war is basically all over, and the evacuation is taking place. The British basically have one foot out the door. And so Carleton says, well, we've got one last chance before everybody scatters to the 4 winds to ask anyone who's still around who remembers what happened in 1776, what happened here? What did you see?
Well, we've talked a fair bit about the logistics of the fire and what the evidence says about who may have started it. And regardless of who started the fire burned about 20% of New York City. So what was that impact? What was the impact of the Great New York Fire for everyday New Yorkers?
Yeah, there's 2 ways to answer that question. What was the intended impact of the fire? The intended impact of the fire seems to have been to burn the entirety of New York City. You deprive the British of winter headquarters, you deprive them of a naval base, you deprive them of restoring New York City to its allegiance and attracting American merchants and American farmers and kind of getting the whole thing going again. You might also have been able to kill some of the British soldiers that were in garrison, right? So there's some people who say, well, the fire had a kind of bloodthirsty element to it as well. That was the intended outcome of the fire. But it doesn't work because only 20% of the city burns down. And so the effect of the fire ends up being a little bit less. Like as far as slowing down the British advance, maybe by 2 days, right? The British had planned an attack on Paulshoek, New Jersey for the 21st. After the fire, they're like, nah, all right, let's put it off for a couple of days. So as far as the British military campaign, it doesn't slow them down that much. The major impact of the fire is both military and civilian, which is that by reducing New York City's housing stock by 20%, it creates strains on being able to house British officers, British troops, loyalist civilians, and loyalist refugees that were coming into New York City from other places. So it really does make life in occupied New York City that much more miserable because of the reduced quantity of housing stock. And one of the things that Ruma Chopra and Don Johnson have argued is one of the places where the British lose the allegiance of American colonists is in these occupied cities, because there are loyalist civilians who become really frustrated with life under occupation and with British decision-making and with, British courts-martial, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the places where the British lose the war is in occupied cities because life is difficult there. And one of the reasons why life was difficult in New York City, which was, the rebellious town that was occupied for the longest amount of time by the British Army, was because the fire had created this canvas town, this slum where, there were people who found shelter by draping ship's canvases over burned out brick husks. But you've lost 20% of the city's buildings. And that does hamper the ability to kind of restore life to New York the way it had been. Many people comment on it becoming a miserable place as a result of this fire.
When were New Yorkers able to reconstruct their city? Was this work to rebuild New York part of the British Army's efforts to help alleviate the impact of the fire on civilians and satisfy their occupying needs? Or was this work that had to wait until after the War for Independence?
For whatever reason, the British do not reconstruct Canvas Town. Maybe they just didn't have the wherewithal. They're deploying their resources elsewhere, et cetera. And it takes the New Yorkers a few years, even after the British have evacuated in 1783, to do something about Canvas Town. They eventually do. They put in the funds to rebuilding the infrastructure and, houses are built on top of the ashes and New York goes ahead and is going to have all of the amazing economic growth that it's going to enjoy in the 19th century. But it does take a few years after the end of the war in 1783.
Now, the full title of Ben's book is The Great New York Fire of 1776, A Lost Story of the American Revolution. Ben, it's hard to believe that anything about New York City, the way we look at the city today, could be a lost story. So would you tell us why you think the story of the Great New York Fire of 1776 has been lost to our historical memories, and how you think that recovering this story might shift how we think about and understand the American Revolution?
I don't call it an unknown story. In the general public, many people don't know that a fifth of New York City burned down in 1776, but even a little bit of reading on New York City and the American Revolution will show you that this massive fire took place. But even within that group of people who know a little bit about revolutionary New York City, this is still a lost story. And it's a lost story, I think, because it's been deliberately buried. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, Washington and his lieutenants and the Continental Congress and rebel newspaper editors get to work saying, pay no attention to this. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain, right? This is not a historically significant event. It wasn't Americans who burned New York City on purpose. It must have been an accident or some miscreants who had nothing to do with the American Rebellion. There's nothing to see here. America is a great country. They don't wantonly burn towns. There's no reason to look at this. The British, on the other hand, they burned tons of towns, which is true. But there's no reason to pay attention to the Americans and a city that they might have burned. So it becomes this kind of deliberately buried story. And 19th century, very patriotic histories kind of pick that up and run with that as well. And so by the time you get to the 20th century, historians didn't really have a lot to go on in order to recover this story. The evidence seemed mixed. It seemed like a lot of the people who were accusing the Americans of having burned New York City were British or loyalist, and so therefore had their own biases. You can put together the evidence and make a plausible case that it was accidental. But I kind of think that American historians needed to take more seriously the idea that Washington or his men burned New York City. And so that is what I argue in the book, is that it is a lost story, and we need to recover it in order to get a more realistic picture of what our war of origins was about. We are a country that was born in war, born in violence. There were some atrocities committed, particularly against indigenous people, right? They would not be shocked at all to hear about Washington burning towns because, of course, the Iroquois called him, the Haudenosaunee called him town destroyer, right? Because of the expedition that he launched during the Sullivan-Clinton expedition of 1779. So everyone knows that the Americans, white Americans, were willing to burn towns. But some historians have suggested, well, they confine that unrestrained warfare to Indian country, right? Because they want to dispossess the Native Americans of their lands, and so they burn tons of Indian towns. But burning white settlements, burning New York City, there are a lot of historians who aren't quite willing to say that the Americans might have done that too. And, I want to make the case for it. If people are going to disagree with me, okay, but I wanted to lay out as much of the evidence that I could. I put forth the evidence that it might have been an accident, but I also put forth the evidence that suggests to me that the fire was done on purpose.
Now we should move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. Ben, if the Great New York Fire of 1776 had never happened, how would the lack of a major fire in New York have impacted the rest of the American War for Independence?
Yeah, well, if we're talking about the American War for Independence, of course, as you know, there are so many big factors that lead to the Americans' victory in the war. But one factor that I think I address in the book is public opinion, right? If the fire had happened and the British had made more of it, maybe they could have convinced more Americans to be like, gosh, these rebels are awfully wild. I think I'm going to stick with King George III. So it's possible that some people's allegiance might have shifted enough that the British would have been able to hold on to some or all of their colonies if the British had made a bigger deal out of the fire. Now, if the fire had never taken place at all, then that creates another factor. Maybe New York would have been a nicer place to live. Maybe that would have given loyalists living in British-occupied New York a better opinion of the British. And so maybe there too, there might have been some point at which the British might have been able to retain more people's allegiance. Now, in the greater scheme of things, maybe that's far-fetched. Maybe we ought to agree with Andrew O'Shaughnessy that the British never could have won this war, that there were too many massive factors in favor of the Americans' successful rebellion. But I'd like to think that the fire mattered, right? And that the fire mattered because it has an influence on these issues of public opinion that have been so interesting for historians to look at lately in looking at the Revolutionary War. The idea that it was not just a military event, but also a political and diplomatic event where the opinions of ordinary people and the shifts in those opinions really mattered as far as the wartime experience of the revolution.
Ben, now that you've finished this project that has captured your attention since 1997, what's next for you? What are you researching and writing about now?
I've had no time to think over the past year. I've been fortunate in that lots of people have been inviting me to speak about it. And then we've recently had the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party. And because I also wrote a book about that event, I was on call in December to give a few talks. So I have some ideas of what I'd like to work on next. And of course, we have the 250th anniversary of independence coming up in 2026. And so I'm certainly happy to be part of the conversations going forward about what was the meaning of the Revolutionary War. But the truth is, I haven't yet decided on what my next direction is going to be. And so because I'm still at the gleam of the eye stage, I don't really have a great answer for you just now. And in the meantime, I've got students to mentor, students to teach, contributions that I want to make to Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. I'm excited to get into the next thing, but it might have to wait a few more months.
And how can we contact you if we have more questions about the Great New York Fire of 1776?
Sure, I maintain a website, benjamincarp.com, and there's a way to contact me there. Or if you know your way around a university website, you can find my email address at the Graduate Center or at Brooklyn College and get in touch with me that way.
Benjamin Carp, thank you so much for joining us and for taking us through the Great New York Fire of 1776.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure. It's really great to talk with you.
Our investigation of the Great New York Fire of 1776 has allowed us to view the American Revolution differently. Rather than explore a battle where the Continental Army triumphed, as they did at Yorktown, or scored a Pyrrhic victory, as they did at the Battle of Bunker Hill, we looked at an American defeat. The fledgling Continental Army and its approximately 10,000 soldiers, which George Washington carefully spread out over 16 miles of Manhattan and Long Island to protect the Continental Army position, that Continental Army could not stand up to the British and hold New York City. The American Army simply couldn't overcome a combined British and German force of 12,000 land troops with strong naval support, which ultimately evicted them from Manhattan during the Battle of Kip's Bay on September 15, 1776. But did the Continental Army set fire to New York City as they retreated from the scene? Ben thinks there is enough evidence to suggest that yes, members of the Continental Army or revolutionary-affiliated spies did set fire to New York City. Although, as Ben admits, we don't have a smoking gun that proves this conclusion as fact. The closest historians have come to having a piece of definitive evidence is a private letter that George Washington wrote to his cousin Lund Washington. In that letter, Washington indicated that he had wanted to burn New York City, but that Congress absolutely forbid it. After a paragraph where Washington tells Lund about his reasons for sending deputies to hear Lord William Howe's peace proposals, Washington states, quote, "In speaking of New York, I had forgot to mention that Providence, or some good honest fellow, has done more for us than we were disposed to do for ourselves, as near 1/4 of the city is supposed to be consumed. However, enough of it remains to answer their purposes." End quote. Like many historians who research a question or a topic, Ben was able to place George Washington's letter and his comments within the larger context of everything else that was written or said about the Great New York Fire of 1776. By looking at Washington's words within this context of all the other evidence that we know about, Ben was able to draw his conclusion that it is highly likely that an American revolutionary set New York ablaze. The result was a fire that burned the southern end of Manhattan through the night of September 20 and into the morning of September 21, 1776. In all, the fire destroyed approximately 20%, or 1/5, of New York City. Now, the story of the Great New York Fire also allows us to see the day-to-day lived reality of the American War for Independence. Even before the war, New Yorkers had lived in fear that a major fire would wipe out their city. But during the war, the chances of that actually happening increased exponentially. So the Great New York Fire also shows us how Americans on the home front, worried that an army would visit and possibly occupy their cities, towns, and farms, would wreak destruction on their property. and that the violence that armies brought with them might hurt or kill someone that they loved. The way that many histories of the American Revolution have been written makes it easy for us to forget that the violence of the war didn't just remain on battlefields. It's also easy for us to miss that the British Army wasn't the only army that committed atrocities in the name of war. Looking at the Great New York Fire of 1776 helps us see this and puts the violence of the war into perspective. Look for more information about Ben, his book, The Great New York Fire of 1776, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/395. Also on the show notes page, you'll find a link to George Washington's October 6, 1776 letter to Lund, Washington, describing Washington's thoughts on the burning of New York City. Plus, you'll also find complimentary episodes from our back catalog that will help you investigate the American Revolution even further and how New York rebuilt itself after the war. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or family member. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios: Jordan Hammond, Ashley Bachnight, Derek Litvak, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what do you think about the evidence for the Great New York Fire of 1776? Do you think the American revolutionaries started that fire? What do you think about the Army's use of fire as a weapon of war? I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.